I froze at the edge of the fence. My absence, was the punchline. She probably got into an accident. My sister's voice snickered. Would save her boss the trouble of firing her. Laughter followed. Familiar, cruel, homegrown. They didn't know I was standing right there, clutching the severance file that could destroy the company they had built together. A company built on my back. My name is Claire Monroe, and I am 34 years old. On that Saturday. The Denver sun felt like a weight, pressing down on the manicured lawns and identical rooftops of the suburbs where my sister lived. It was the kind of oppressive, placid heat that makes you feel like you're moving through water. I was driving my sensible sedan, a car chosen for its reliability and not its personality, much like the role I played in my family. On the passenger seat beside me sat a thick, deceptively bland manila folder, stamped with the crisp, navy blue logo of Monroe and Daughters Logistics. The irony of that name had long ago curdled from a dull ache into a permanent, bitter taste in my mouth. There was only one daughter that mattered in that equation, and it wasn't me. I was supposed to be dropping off the final revised contracts for the quarterly review. It was a task that could have been an email, a simple digital transfer. But Hannah insisted on hard copies. It's about presence. Claire, she'd said, her voice dripping with the condescending patience she reserved for me. It shows we're thorough, hands-on. What it really was another way to remind me of my place, the glorified errand girl, the one who did the meticulous, thankless work while she, the CEO, networked over expensive lunches. I pulled up to the curb a few houses down from hers, a habit born from years of wanting to delay the inevitable moment of interaction. The neighborhood was quiet, the air filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and chlorine from a nearby pool. I grabbed the folder and got out, my sensible heels sinking slightly into the sun-softened asphalt. I chose the side gate, the one that led through the narrow passage to the backyard. It was quicker, less chance of being drawn into a conversation I didn't have the energy for. I just wanted to drop the file on the doorstep, send a text, and leave, a clean, sterile transaction. As I rounded the corner of the house, the sound reached me first, laughter. It wasn't a single, joyful burst, but a layered, rolling wave of it. There was my sister Hannah's sharp, cutting cackle, the one that always sounded more like a judgment than an expression of mirth. There was my mother's lighter, more musical laugh, the one that followed Hannah's like a loyal echo, and underpinning it all was the booming, slightly forced guffaw of my stepfather, Richard, a man who had married into our family and immediately understood that his comfort depended on aligning himself with its power structure, namely, Hannah. They were on the back patio, hidden from my view by the tall wooden privacy fence. I slowed my steps, my hand hovering near the latch of the gate. I should just open it, stride in, and interrupt them, put on the placid, unaffected face I had perfected over decades. But something held me back, a primal instinct, a sense of danger. I stood there, a silent observer separated by a few planks of wood. And then I heard Hannah's voice, slicing through the warm air, clear as a bell. I just hope she got into an accident on the way over. The world stopped. The buzzing of a nearby lawnmower faded. The chirping of sparrows in the oak tree ceased. The sun on my skin felt suddenly cold. My own name wasn't mentioned, but it didn't need to be. I was the she. I was the only one they could have been expecting. The words weren't just spoken, they were deployed. A missile of casual cruelty, an accident, a wish for my harm, my incapacitation, my death, spoken as a light-hearted jest. A beat of silence hung in the air, and for a wild, desperate second, I prayed I had misheard. I prayed for someone to say, "Hannah, don't say that," for my mother to scold her, for some flicker of decency. Instead, the laughter erupted. It was louder this time, sharper, uglier. It wasn't the polite tittering of people uncomfortable with a dark joke. It was genuine, appreciative amusement. They were laughing at the image of me, somewhere on a Denver highway, mangled in a wreck. That was the punchline. My fingers found the rough wood of the gate, and I gripped it, my knuckles turning white. A tremor started in my hand, a violent, uncontrollable shiver that threatened to travel up my arm and consume my whole body. I felt my breath catch, trapped in my lungs like a scream I couldn't release. Then, my mother's voice, laced with that same amused, dismissive tone she used whenever I tried to express a real emotion. "Oh, you know her. She always was dramatic. She's probably just crying in her car again over some imagined slight." The second missile hit, a direct strike to a wound that had never been allowed to heal. Dramatic, the word they used to invalidate my pain, my frustration, my reality, crying in my car, a secret, private moment of despair she had somehow intuited and was now serving up as entertainment for the table. It was a confirmation that my deepest vulnerabilities were nothing more than a source of family anecdote, a running gag. My legs felt weak, and I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the fence. I had to see. I needed the visual evidence to burn this moment into my memory, to cauterize the last vestiges of hope I secretly harbored that they might, someday, see me. I found a small knothole, a tiny gap between the slats, and peered through. The scene was a perfect picture of domestic bliss. They were sitting around a wrought iron patio table, a bottle of crisp white wine sweating in the center. Hannah, in a vibrant red sundress, held her glass aloft, a smirk playing on her lips. My mother, elegant even in her casual weekend attire, smiled at her, a look of pure, uncomplicated adoration on her face. Richard was leaning back in his chair, his face ruddy with laughter. They clinked their glasses together, a toast, a celebration of my imagined demise, or at the very least, my perpetual misery. In that moment, I felt a profound and terrifying sense of detachment, as if I had floated out of my own body. I wasn't Claire Monroe, daughter, sister, employee, standing in the heat. I was an audience member watching a film about a stranger's life falling apart, a movie where the villains were sipping Chardonnay in the sun, utterly confident in their righteousness, while the protagonist stood silently in the shadows, bleeding from 1,000 invisible cuts. They were the family. I was the outsider, the inconvenient footnote to their perfect story. The spell broke. The paralysis receded, replaced by a glacial calm that settled deep in my bones. The shaking in my hands stopped. My breathing evened out. The heat and the noise of the neighborhood rushed back in. But it all felt distant, muffled, as if happening behind a thick pane of glass. Silently, I took a step back from the fence, then another. I turned and walked, not ran, back to my car. My movements were precise, deliberate. Each step was a conscious decision to move away from that gate, from that yard, from that life. I didn't look back. I reached my car and opened the trunk. The interior was dark and cool. I looked at the manila folder still in my hand, at the logo for Monroe and Daughters Logistics. With a strange sense of reverence, I placed it inside, nestling it behind the emergency kit. It no longer felt like a burden, it felt like a weapon. Because inside that folder, beneath the neatly clipped quarterly contracts I was supposed to deliver, was a separate, sealed envelope. Inside that envelope was a copy of the confidential bidding proposal for the McVeigh-Norris distribution deal, a project worth $12.4 million that had single-handedly saved our company from a disastrous third quarter. And on the signature line of that proposal, clear as day, was my name, Claire E. Monroe, forged in a painfully accurate imitation of my handwriting, Hannah's imitation. Alongside it were the server logs I had painstakingly and quietly pulled over the last 3 weeks, showing the file was accessed and submitted from her IP address, at a time I was documented to be in a mandatory HR seminar across town. There were emails from her personal account to the contractor, referencing conversations she claimed I had. It was a perfect, airtight case of fraud, identity theft, and corporate malfeasance. She hadn't just stolen the credit. She had used my identity as a shield, making me legally culpable if the deal's questionable financial arrangements ever came under scrutiny. I had found it by accident, but I had gathered the evidence by design. Unsure of what I would do with it, a part of me, the part that still foolishly craved their approval, thought I might use it as leverage, to finally demand the respect I deserved. But now, standing by the trunk of my car in the quiet suburban street, that thought seemed laughably naive. They didn't deal in respect. They dealt in power, in ridicule, in casual cruelty. They didn't just want me to fail. They were hoping for it, toasting to it. I closed the trunk. The sound was a soft, definitive thud that echoed in the stillness. It was the sound of a door closing forever, the sound of an ending and of a beginning. I looked back toward the house, toward the faint, oblivious sound of their continued laughter. I thought of Hannah's words, her wish for an accident, a wish to have me erased. A small, cold smile touched my own lips for the first time that day. I leaned against the warm metal of my car and whispered the words to the empty street, a promise to myself. No accident. Hannah, just impact. The drive home was an exercise in forced calm. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, my eyes fixed on the road, my foot applying just the right amount of pressure to the accelerator. I stopped fully at every stop sign. I used my turn signal. To any other driver on the road, I was just another person running errands on a Saturday afternoon. But inside, a tectonic shift was occurring. The landscape of my life, the one I had navigated with gritted teeth and a weary heart for years, was fracturing, breaking apart to reveal the toxic bedrock beneath. That laughter was the earthquake. Monroe and Daughters. Logistics. The name itself was a lie. The first of many. It had been my father's dream, born in the garage of our first home. He was the Monroe, a man whose integrity was as solid as the shipping containers he managed, and we were the Daughters, plural. Hannah, with her easy charm and social grace, was the face. I, with my head for numbers and an obsession with detail, was the engine. He saw us as two parts of a whole, yin and yang. Hannah will win them the client. Claire, he used to tell me, ruffling my hair as I sat hunched over his ledgers, but you'll make sure we don't lose our shirts keeping them. He valued my quiet diligence. He called it my superpower. He made the plural in daughters feel real. Then, the heart attack at 52. Sudden, brutal, and final. It didn't just take our father, it took the balance of our world with him. My mother, adrift in her grief, found an anchor in Richard a year later. He was a kind enough man, a retired wealth manager with a portfolio that ensured my mother would never have to worry about money again. He was also a man who understood hierarchies. He saw quickly that Hannah, with her glittering ambition and ruthless streak, was the sun around which our family now orbited. My mother, wanting peace above all else, let her shine, and I, the quieter, more complicated daughter, became a shadow. The company, my father's legacy, was handed to Hannah on a silver platter. She was named CEO at 29. I was the contracts manager, a title I had earned through years of apprenticeship at my father's side. I understood the intricate dance of liability clauses, insurance riders, and international shipping regulations better than anyone. For a few years, it worked. I was the engine. She was the face. I did the work. She took the credit. It was an unjust but stable system. The demotion came on a Tuesday. I was called into the main conference room, the one with the gleaming mahogany table and the view of the Denver skyline. Hannah sat at the head, looking impossibly chic in a cream-colored power suit. My mother was beside her, a neutral expression on her face that was anything but Claire. Hannah began, her voice smooth and rehearsed. We've been reviewing departmental synergies and overall corporate harmony. Corporate harmony, the phrase hung in the air like a bad smell. And we feel that your intensity is creating certain challenges. There have been some complaints about your attitude. My attitude. The word landed like a slap. My attitude was questioning why she had promised a client a delivery schedule that was physically impossible without violating federal labor laws. My attitude was pointing out that the budget she'd approved for a new software suite was laughably inadequate. My attitude was my refusal to smile and nod when her ambition outpaced her competence. So, she continued, steepling her fingers, We've decided to make a change. We're creating a new position for you as head of administrative services. It'll be a better fit for your organizational skills. Less client-facing. Head of administrative services, a glorified office manager. I was being moved from the company's heart to its appendix. I looked at my mother. I pleaded with my eyes for her to intervene, to remember the promise she made to my father to look after us both, to honor his vision. She just gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a tiny gesture that screamed, "Don't make a scene. Don't make this difficult." And so, I was exiled. I watched from my new, smaller office as Hannah ran the company on charm and adrenaline. She was brilliant in a boardroom, a master of schmoozing and networking. The business press loved her, calling her a titan of industry, a visionary. They praised her for being a great connector. But I knew the truth. She didn't connect. She drained. She would come to me with a problem, a tangled mess of a contract, and I would spend a week of sleepless nights untangling it, creating a solution, and drafting the language. She would take my work, put her name on it, and present it as a stroke of her own genius. She was a parasite, and I was the host. The discovery of the forged contract was the moment the sickness revealed itself to be terminal. It was a deal with an overseas parts supplier, one with a notoriously shady reputation. I had explicitly advised against it months earlier in a detailed memo, which Hannah had ignored. The deal was now, predictably, being flagged for financial irregularities by our own auditors. An internal investigation was quietly underway. One night, working late to chase down an unrelated paper trail, I stumbled upon the original digital submission file, buried deep on the server. I opened it, and my blood ran cold. There it was, my signature. A flawless forgery, but a forgery nonetheless. She hadn't just stolen credit, she had used my name, my reputation for integrity, as a shield for her own reckless and potentially illegal dealings. If the investigation turned nasty, it wouldn't be Hannah Monroe, CEO, whose name was on the fraudulent document. It would be Claire Monroe, the disgruntled, demoted sister with an attitude problem. I was the perfect fall guy. The next morning, I went to my mother. I found her in the sun-drenched kitchen of the house she shared with Richard, the house my father's life insurance had paid for. I laid it out for her, calmly and rationally. I showed her a printout of the signature. I explained the implications, the criminal liability. I thought, this will be it. This is the line that cannot be crossed. She will finally see Hannah for who she is. She listened patiently, her brow furrowed. When I was finished, she took a slow sip of her coffee and looked out at her perfectly manicured garden. "Claire," she said, her voice soft, "you're overreacting. I'm sure Hannah had a reason. You know how much pressure she's under." "A reason?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "Mom, this is fraud. It's a crime. She put my name on it." "Don't be so dramatic," she replied, waving a dismissive hand. "It's a family business. Sometimes we have to be flexible. The important thing is to present a united front. Don't make waves. Honey, family comes first." Family comes first. The words were a death sentence to the part of me that still believed in fairness, in maternal protection. Family didn't mean love or support. It meant an obligation on my part to absorb any and all damage to protect the golden child. It was a code of silence that only I was expected to uphold. I walked out of her kitchen that day a different person. The hope I had carried, the foolish, childish belief that if I just worked hard enough, was quiet enough, was good enough, they would finally see my worth, died in that sun-drenched room. That's when I began to collect the evidence. It was no longer about getting credit or demanding respect. It was about survival. Every evening, after the office had emptied out, I would sit at my desk and meticulously build my case. I downloaded server logs, I archived emails, I cross-referenced financial statements with access timestamps. I compiled a digital fortress of proof, each file a perfectly cut stone in the wall I was building around myself. I knew that if when Hannah's house of cards came tumbling down, I would need more than the truth. I would need indisputable, undeniable proof. I knew that if I used it, the company my father built would collapse. My sister would face ruin, possibly prison. My mother and stepfather would be caught in the financial and social fallout. The Monroe name would be dragged through the mud. It would be the end of everything. But now, driving away from Hannah's house with the echo of their laughter still ringing in my ears, that destruction no longer seemed like a tragedy. It seemed like a consequence. They had toasted to my accident, to my pain. They had revealed their deepest wish for me. In doing so, they had severed the last thread that bound me to them. They were not my family. They were my adversaries in a business transaction that had gone bad. I got home to my quiet, empty apartment. I took the manila folder from the trunk and placed the sealed envelope on my desk. Then, I opened my purse and took out a small, silver USB drive, my backup, my insurance, my justice. The choice was no longer a choice. It was an inevitability. They had just given me the permission I needed to save myself. The days following that Saturday in the sun were not filled with tears or rage. The violent, churning sea of emotion had receded, leaving behind a vast, quiet, and unnervingly calm expanse. Pain, I learned, is a hot and messy thing. What replaced it was cold, clean, and sharp. It was the feeling of a perfectly calibrated machine humming to life. The objective was no longer to be heard or understood. The objective was to win, and winning, I knew, was not about a single, explosive confrontation. It was about strategy, timing, and choosing the perfect ground on which to fight. To send the evidence of the forged signature to the board of directors immediately would have been a mistake. It would have been emotional. They would have seen it as the hysterical act of a jealous sister. The fulfillment of the attitude problem narrative Hannah had so carefully constructed for me. It would have become a family drama, played out in hushed conference rooms, with my mother pleading for unity and Richard offering bland mediations. They would have tried to manage it, to contain me, to bury it under the suffocating blanket of family comes first. I was not interested in a skirmish. I was planning a war. And the first rule of warfare is to never engage the enemy on their terms. So I waited. I went to work at my dead-end administrative desk every day. I sorted mail. I coordinated schedules. I ordered office supplies. I performed the role of the beaten, compliant sister with chilling perfection. I smiled my empty smile in the hallways. I gave Hannah the deferential nod she expected. And all the while, I was listening. I read every email memo that crossed my desk, listened to every snippet of conversation by the coffee machine. I was a ghost in the machine, and ghosts see everything. It took 2 weeks to find my target. The name started as a whisper, then grew into a buzz that filled the entire office. Brightwell Freight. They were a logistics giant, an international conglomerate with a market cap larger than the GDP of some small countries. They were looking to acquire a mid-size regional partner in the Mountain West to streamline their domestic operations. Monroe and Daughters was a finalist. The deal was worth $38 million. It would be the crowning achievement of Hannah's career, the move that would elevate her from a local business celebrity to a national player. It was her entire world. I spent a weekend doing a deep dive on Brightwell Freight. They were not just big, they were meticulous. Their corporate identity was built on a fanatical devotion to ethics and transparency. Their annual reports, read like sermons on the importance of corporate integrity. Their CEO, a man named Julian Croft, had once canceled a 9-figure merger because of a minor kickback scandal discovered in the other company's Lithuanian office. They didn't just avoid fraud, they abhorred it. They were a company that would rather burn $1 billion than have their reputation stained by a single drop of ink from a forged signature. They were, in short, the perfect weapon. Hannah, in her arrogance, saw them as a prize to be won. I saw them as the anvil upon which I would break her. The forged contract was strong, but I wanted more. I wanted something that couldn't possibly be debated or spun. I wanted something that was not just about one bad decision, but about a foundational lie. I found it on a Tuesday night, long after the cleaning crews had gone home. The idea came to me as I was troubleshooting a glitch in our inventory tracking system. The system was called Logicore 2.0. On the surface, It was a sleek, efficient piece of software, the digital backbone of our entire operation. Hannah often boasted about it to clients and investors, claiming the company had invested heavily in its development with a high-end tech firm. This was a lie. There was no high-end tech firm, there was only me. In the years after my father's death, before Hannah's ambition had fully eclipsed my existence, I had poured my grief and my intellect into a project no one knew about. I had taught myself to code, spending thousands of hours at night and on weekends building a proprietary logistics management system from the ground up. It was my secret masterpiece, a way of honoring my father's obsession with efficiency. When it was finished, I showed it to Hannah, naively thinking it would be something we could share, a joint contribution to his legacy. She had been dismissive at first, then intrigued. She took it, rebranded it, and presented it to the board as an expensive acquisition. I was never mentioned. My quiet superpower, as my father had called it, was strip-mined for her own glory. They had demoted me, but they had been sloppy. In their haste to move me to a department with no real power, they had failed to properly scrub my old system permissions. I still had back-end access. That night, sitting in the silent, darkened office, I navigated to the source code, and there it was, in the metadata of every single module. In the comments I had left on thousands of lines of code was my digital signature, my username, and a timestamp. C. Monroe Dev, Claire Monroe, developer. It was an immutable, cryptographic record of creation, an undeniable digital fingerprint. Hannah hadn't just forged my signature on a contract, she had stolen my intellectual property, the very heart of the company, and built her entire reign upon it. This was not just fraud. This was a grand theft that dwarfed the $12.4 million contract. The Brightwell deal was contingent on their acquisition of Monroe and Daughters' assets, and I was about to prove that the company's single most valuable asset did not, in fact, belong to the company at all. It belonged to me. The feeling that washed over me was not elation. It was a cold, pure certainty. The path ahead was now illuminated with the harsh, unforgiving light of a surgeon's lamp. The next phase of the plan was about precision and redundancy. A single point of failure was not an option. Over the next week, I meticulously packaged the evidence, the full source code of Logicor with my embedded signatures, the server logs showing Hannah's fraudulent submission of the McVeigh-Norris contract, the emails, the timelines, everything. I compiled it all into a single, encrypted folder. Then I made 3 identical copies on 3 separate USB drives. The first drive went to my lawyer. I didn't choose a family law attorney. I chose a man named Marcus Thorne, a corporate litigator known for his scorched-earth tactics and exorbitant fees. I sat in his sterile, glass-walled office and laid out the case without a single flicker of emotion. He listened, reviewed the summary I had prepared, and a slow, reptilian smile spread across his face. "Ms. Monroe," he said, his voice a low purr. "This is not a case. This is a public execution." I left the first USB drive with him. The second drive was for posterity. I placed it in a small, padded envelope, addressed it to myself, and sent it via registered mail. I tracked it online until it was delivered to my apartment's lockbox. I left it there. An unopened, federally postmarked package is a powerful thing in a courtroom. It establishes a timeline. It proves that the evidence existed long before any accusations were made. It was the move of a planner, not a reactor. The third drive was for Hannah. Her 35th birthday was in 3 weeks. The same week the Brightwell deal was scheduled to be signed. The timing was poetry. I went to the most expensive stationery store in the Cherry Creek shopping district and bought a beautiful, ridiculously overpriced gift box, shimmering silver with a black silk ribbon. At home, I lined it with black tissue paper and placed the small, unassuming USB drive in the center. It looked like a piece of minimalist jewelry. Then, I took out a matching card. My hand was perfectly steady as I uncapped a pen. "What do you write to the sister you are about to destroy?" I thought for a moment. The memory of her voice in the backyard echoing in my mind. I hope she got into an accident. I smiled. A real smile this time, thin and sharp. I wrote 7 simple words on the card. From the sister who didn't crash yet. I sealed the envelope and placed it in the box. I tied the silk ribbon into a perfect bow. I looked at the finished product. This beautiful, elegant vessel of destruction. There was no grief, no anger, no hesitation. The pain I had carried for so long, the dull, heavy weight of being the lesser daughter, had been burned away in the fire of her laughter. All that was left was the clean, hard, and perfect geometry of my plan. I was no longer a victim feeling her way through the dark. I was an architect standing in front of her completed blueprint. All that was left was to begin construction. The Grand Hyatt Ballroom in downtown Denver was a cathedral of corporate ambition. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off crystal water glasses and the polished chrome of expensive laptops. The air was cool and still, humming with the low murmur of 100 hushed conversations. This was a room built for power, for deals that altered skylines and shifted markets. It was the perfect stage for an execution. From my position at the back of the room, leaning against a velvet-draped wall, I watched my sister command the stage. Hannah was a vision in a blood-red dress, a slash of defiant color against the muted backdrop of gray and navy suits. She stood at a sleek, transparent lectern, the very picture of modern, dynamic leadership. Her voice, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system, was smooth and confident, each word a carefully polished stone laid in the foundation of her grand narrative. "That's what this partnership with Brightwell Freight represents," she was saying, her smile radiating a practiced warmth that never quite reached her eyes. "It's not just about growth. It's about a shared commitment to the values that my father, Robert Monroe, built this company on: transparency, accountability, and above all, integrity." A ripple of polite applause moved through the audience. I saw my mother in the front row, dabbing at the corner of her eye with a handkerchief. Her face a mask of maternal pride. Beside her, Richard beamed, looking every bit the proud stepfather. They were watching a saint being canonized. I was watching a liar perform her greatest lie. I had slipped in unnoticed 10 minutes earlier, a ghost in a simple, charcoal gray suit. In my hand, I held a slim leather portfolio. Tucked inside was a single folder, its tab bearing a neatly printed label, "Confidential." IP ownership and provenance, Logicor 2.0. I didn't need the folder, not really. The evidence was on the USB drive in my pocket, but the folder was a prop, a visual cue. It was the flag I would plant on the summit of her ruin. The company's CFO, a nervous man named Arthur, finished his presentation on projected Q4 earnings, his voice trembling with an excitement that was almost pathetic. Then, the master of ceremonies, a hired professional with a plastic smile and a booming voice, returned to the lectern. "And now," he announced, his voice echoing slightly in the vast room, "the moment we have all been waiting for, a historic moment for Monroe and Daughters Logistics and for the future of domestic freight. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Mr. Julian Croft, CEO of Brightwell Freight, for the official signing of this landmark agreement." Another, more enthusiastic round of applause. Julian Croft, a man with a severe haircut and an impeccably tailored suit, rose from his seat in the front row and joined Hannah on stage. A small, ornate table was wheeled to the center of the stage, bearing a leather-bound contract and 2 gleaming fountain pens. The air crackled with anticipation. Photographers from various trade publications and local news outlets raised their cameras, their lenses like a firing squad taking aim. This was it, the apex of her ascent, the highest point from which to fall. As Hannah reached for her pen, her smile blindingly bright for the cameras, I pushed myself off the wall. I took a calm, deliberate step forward into the aisle, and I raised my hand. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was a simple, clear motion. But in that room, at that precise moment, it was as loud as a scream. A few heads turned, then a few more. A confused murmur rippled through the audience. On stage, the MC frowned, momentarily thrown off his script. Hannah's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. a tiny crack in the porcelain. Her eyes scanned the room, and then they found me. For a moment, she looked confused, as if she couldn't quite place this drab gray figure in the context of her glorious triumph. "Excuse me," I said. My voice was not loud, but it was clear and steady, and it carried in the sudden, curious silence. I didn't need the microphone. Every ear in the room was already strained in my direction. Before the signing proceeds, I have some documentation that I believe is pertinent to the assets being discussed in this acquisition. The room went utterly still. It was the kind of absolute, profound silence that feels like a physical pressure against your eardrums. Every head was now turned towards me. I could feel their collective gaze, 100 pairs of eyes filled with confusion, annoyance, and a dawning, hungry curiosity. On stage, Hannah froze. Her hand hovered over the pen. Paralyzed, the brilliant, camera-ready smile was gone, replaced by a rigid mask of disbelief. The color began to drain from her face, leaving her lipstick a garish, bloody slash against her suddenly pale skin. I saw my mother in the front row, her hand flying to her chest, her expression of pride curdling into one of horror and confusion. I walked forward, my heels clicking a slow, steady rhythm on the polished floor. I didn't rush. I let the moment stretch, let the tension build to an unbearable, exquisite tautness. I walked past the rows of stunned executives and shareholders until I reached the small set of stairs leading to the stage. I ascended them. I walked directly to the signing table, ignoring the sputtering MC and the icy, murderous glare from my sister. I looked at Julian Croft, the CEO of Brightwell, a man whose entire brand was built on due diligence. "Mr. Croft," I said, my voice still level. "My name is Claire Monroe. My apologies for the interruption, but Brightwell is preparing to pay $38 million for a company whose primary operational asset, the Logicore 2.0 software, is stolen property." A collective gasp went through the room. Hannah made a small, strangled sound, a mix of a scoff and a sob. I opened my portfolio, but instead of the folder, I took out the small, silver USB drive. I held it up between my thumb and forefinger, a tiny object that held the weight of an entire company. Then, I placed it gently on the polished wood of the table, next to the 9-figure contract. "I am the sole developer of the Logicore system," I announced, my voice resonating with an authority it had never held before. I turned my gaze from Croft and settled it directly on my sister. "I am the person who wrote every line of code. My digital signature is embedded in the metadata of every module as proof of authorship. This woman," I said, my voice dropping slightly, becoming colder, harder, used her administrative privileges to have my name and credentials systematically scrubbed from the user-facing interface, and then presented my intellectual property to her board, her investors, and to you, as a corporate asset she had acquired. Hannah stood as if she'd been turned to stone. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer curious. It was heavy, judgmental. Then, a man in the front row, a sharp-faced man I recognized from my research as Brightwell's chief legal counsel, stood up. "We are immediately postponing this signing pending a full and immediate review of this allegation," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. He gave Julian Croft a sharp, meaningful look. Croft, his face a grim, unreadable mask, gave a curt nod. That was the signal. The dam broke. The low hum of shocked whispers erupted into a roar of conversation. And then came the lights, a series of brilliant, blinding flashes as the photographers, smelling blood in the water, began shooting in a frenzy. The flashes illuminated Hannah's face, catching the single, terrified tear that was tracing a path through her perfect makeup. She turned to me, her body trembling with a rage so profound it seemed to vibrate in the air between us. Her voice was a venomous whisper, meant only for me, lost in the noise but as clear to my ears as a scream. "You wouldn't dare." I looked into her eyes, the eyes that had watched me, dismissed me, and laughed at my pain my entire life. I felt nothing. No pity, no remorse, no triumph. Just the quiet, clean finality of a task completed. I already did. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. Marcus, my lawyer, had materialized at my side as if from thin air, his hand on my elbow, steering me through the stunned crowd with the quiet efficiency of a Secret Service agent. We were in an elevator, then a black car. Before the first news van had even arrived, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel the shockwave I had generated expanding behind me, a silent, concussive force that was about to flatten the world I had just left. By the time the car dropped me at my apartment, my phone was already buzzing. It wasn't the frantic, desperate calls from my family I had expected. Not yet. It was something far more potent. It was the world waking up to the story. The first news alert came from a local Denver business journal, a dry, factual notification that pulsed on my screen: Monroe and Daughters. Brightwell Freight mega deal halted mid-signing. It was a start. I walked into my apartment, kicked off my heels, and sank onto my sofa. The phone buzzed again. This time it was Bloomberg News. The headline sharper, more incisive IP. Theft allegation derails 38 Mamawas. Logistics merger. Whistleblower claims CEO. Sister forged software ownership. Whistleblower. The word felt strange, clinical. It wasn't a word for a sister, for a daughter. It was the word for a stranger, an outsider who exposes a crime. It was perfect. They had made me an outsider my whole life. I was simply acting the part. The story was a spark hitting a gas-soaked field. Within 2 hours, it was a raging inferno. I opened my laptop and watched the conflagration spread in real time. Tech blogs were dissecting the term digital signature, explaining to their readers how damning my evidence of authorship was. Financial news outlets were running speculative pieces on the future of Monroe and Daughters, its stock symbol, MLDL, flashing ominously in red on every major market tracker. My father had taken the company public on a small regional exchange years ago, a move Hannah had loved for the prestige it gave her. Now, that prestige was turning into a public crucifixion. I watched the numbers. At the opening bell that morning, MLDL had been trading at a 5-year high in anticipation of the Brightwell deal. Now, it was in free fall. 12%, 15%. I refreshed the page. 19%. It was like watching a patient bleed out on a monitor. Every percentage point was a shareholder's panic, a lost investment, a crack in the foundation of my sister's empire. By the time the markets closed, Monroe and Daughters Logistics had lost 23% of its value, millions of dollars of perceived worth, incinerated in a single afternoon because of a single sentence spoken in a backyard. Around 6 p.m., an unknown number with a New York area code rang. I hesitated, then answered, my voice a calm, neutral. Hello? Ms. Monroe. This is Julian Croft. The voice of Brightwell's CEO was exactly as I'd imagined, crisp, controlled, and utterly devoid of warmth. There was a pause. I imagine you are having an eventful day. Something like that, Mr. Croft? I'm not calling to discuss the events of this afternoon. Our legal team will handle that. I'm calling for a different reason, he said. I could hear the faint sound of a car horn in the background. He was likely on his way to the airport, leaving the smoldering wreckage of our deal behind him. In my business, I deal with lies every single day, calculated omissions, inflated projections, hidden liabilities. It is exceedingly rare to encounter someone with the courage to tell the unvarnished truth at such a high personal cost. We appreciate your integrity, Ms. Monroe. It's a commodity in short supply. He wasn't offering me a job. He wasn't promising me anything. It was something more valuable. It was validation from the one person in that room whose opinion carried global weight. He saw integrity where my family saw betrayal. He saw courage where they saw destruction. He hung up before I could reply. Then came the message I had been waiting for. It wasn't a call. A call would have required a conversation, and my mother knew I would not give her one. It was a text. A single, gray bubble on my screen. From Mom. You have killed this family. I stared at the words. There was no punctuation, just a flat, declarative statement of fact. For a moment, the old Claire, the one who lived for scraps of their approval, felt a familiar pang, a flicker of guilt, but it was a phantom pain, a memory of an amputated limb. I thought of her face in the crowd, not horrified by Hannah's actions, but by my exposure of them. The crime wasn't the theft. The crime was the telling. I looked at her words one last time. You have killed this family. The sentence was wrong. The family was already dead. I was just signing the death certificate. I set the phone face down on the coffee table. I did not reply. The avalanche was just beginning. My act of defiance had created a fissure in the dam of silence and fear that Hannah had built around the company. And now, others were starting to crawl through. An anonymous account on Twitter, @MonroeLogiLeaker, appeared. The first tweet read, "Claire Monroe is telling the truth, and that's not even the half of it. Monroe Logistics." Then came the posts on Glassdoor, the employee review site. Years of suppressed resentment came pouring out. Stories of faked sales reports to boost quarterly numbers. Allegations of a scheme involving phantom contracts with shell corporations to secure lines of credit. Accusations of Hannah's verbal abuse, of her taking credit for the work of dozens of employees. Not just me. It turned out I wasn't the only ghost whose work had been stolen. I was just the first one to come back and haunt the place. The company wasn't a shining monument to my father's legacy. It was a rotten structure, eaten from the inside out by my sister's greed. I hadn't thrown a grenade into a pristine temple. I had tossed a single, sharp stone at a building that was already collapsing. I just made it fall faster. The final confirmation of my victory arrived at 9:47 p.m. It was an email from Marcus Thorne, my lawyer. The subject line was simple: official communication. Attached was a PDF on the letterhead of the company's corporate law firm. It was a formal notice. Please be advised that, effective immediately, Ms. Hannah Monroe has been placed on a temporary, paid leave of absence from her duties as Chief Executive Officer of Monroe and Daughters Logistics, pending a full internal investigation by a specially appointed committee of the Board of Directors. I read the cold, legalistic prose. The machine was working. The wheels of corporate justice, which I had set in motion, were now grinding forward on their own. I was no longer the driver. I was just a spectator. I closed the laptop. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the vast grid of the city skyline outside my window. The phone was still buzzing intermittently on the table, a dying nerve. I ignored it. I walked to the kitchen, to the wine rack where a special bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon had been sitting for 2 years, a gift from my father from a trip to Napa. He took the year before he died. I had been saving it for a moment that felt important enough. A promotion I never got. An engagement that never happened. I opened it. The cork came out with a soft, satisfying sigh. I poured a glass, the wine a deep, dark red, almost the color of the dress Hannah had worn. I walked back to the window and looked out at the city lights, at the world that now knew my name. I thought about the sound of their laughter on that sunny Saturday afternoon. It already felt like it had happened a lifetime ago, to a different person. They had wished for my destruction, and in doing so, had handed me the blueprint for theirs. I raised my glass to the skyline, a silent toast to myself. I took a sip. The wine was rich and complex. It tasted like justice. You laughed first. I whispered to the reflection in the glass. It was 3 days after the shareholder meeting, 3 days of a strange, suspended reality. I had not left my apartment. I'd had groceries delivered. I'd unplugged my landline and set my phone to a permanent do not disturb mode, allowing only calls from Marcus to come through. The world outside was a raging storm of headlines and speculation, but inside my small, quiet space, I was in the eye of the hurricane. The silence was a balm, a necessary period of decompression after pulling the pin on a grenade I'd been clutching for years. The call came on a Wednesday morning. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but it was local. Against my better judgment, A flicker of morbid curiosity made me answer. For a moment, there was only the sound of ragged, unsteady breathing on the other end. I almost hung up. Then, her voice. It was not the smooth, polished CEO voice she used in public. It was not the condescending, amused tone she used with me. This was a voice I had not heard in years. A voice scraped raw with fury and disbelief. It was the voice of the playground bully who had just been punched in the mouth for the first time. "You have 5 minutes to tell me why I shouldn't drive over there and kill you myself." I said nothing. I walked to the window and looked down at the city streets below. Cars moved like blood cells through the arteries of the city, everyone going about their day, oblivious. "Are you there?" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Or are you too much of a coward to even speak to me after what you did?" "I'm here, Hannah," I said, my voice quiet, even. A harsh, bitter laugh came through the phone. "Oh, you're here. Of course you are. Hiding in your little apartment while the world burns down around you. Are you happy now? Is this what you wanted?" I watched a bus pull away from a stop. What I wanted was irrelevant to you for 34 years. Why would you start caring now? "Don't you dare play the victim with me," she screamed, the sound distorting through the small speaker. "Don't you dare. You walked into that room and you blew up my life, our life, the company Dad built. You torched it all. For what? What was so important that you had to destroy everything?" She paused, her breathing heavy. "Tell me. For what?" "Because of one stupid throwaway comment I made in the backyard." There it was, the fundamental, unbridgeable chasm between our realities. To her, it was a single data point, an anomaly, a stupid comment. She had already filed it away as an overreaction on my part, another example of my dramatic personality. She was incapable of seeing it for what it was, the final piece of evidence in a lifetime-long prosecution. A strange calm settled over me. I wasn't talking to my sister, the CEO. I was talking to the child on the playground who broke my favorite toy and then laughed when I cried. I was talking to the teenager who read my diary aloud to her friends. I was talking to the woman who had systematically erased me from my own life. "No, Hannah," I said, and my voice was so low and steady it surprised even me. "It wasn't for a comment. It was for my entire life. It was for every time you took my idea and called it your own. It was for every holiday you spent telling stories that made me the punchline. It was for every time you looked at me with that little smirk, the one that said, 'You're smart, Claire, but you'll never be me.' It was for every single day that you made it clear that in the story of our family, you were the star, and I was, at best, a footnote. You didn't just make a comment in the backyard. Hannah, you just finally said the quiet part out loud." There was a moment of stunned silence on her end. I had never spoken to her like this before. My role was to absorb, to endure, to retreat. I had never, ever fired back. I was just joking," she stammered, her voice losing its sharp edge, replaced by a note of defensive incredulity. "It's how we are. We tease each other. God, you've always been so sensitive." "No," I said, cutting her off, the single word as sharp as a shard of glass. "That's not a joke. A joke is when everyone laughs. Hannah, what you do is different. You've built a career, a life, on the idea that hurting people is a form of humor. As long as you're the one telling the joke, you're not a teaser, you're a bully, and you finally run out of people who are willing to be your punching bag." A sound came through the phone then, a choked, wet sound. She was crying. It wasn't the performative, crocodile tears she used to get her way in boardrooms. This was the ragged, ugly sound of true despair, the sound of a queen who had been permanently dethroned. Mom is a wreck," she sobbed, the words tumbling out between gasps. "She won't get out of bed. Richard had to call the doctor. Her blood pressure is through the roof. She keeps saying you've put her in an early grave. You did this to her. You're killing our mother. Claire, was it worth it? Was destroying Mom worth? Whatever point you think you were trying to make." The old Claire would have shattered at those words. The guilt would have been a physical force, a hand closing around my throat. I would have apologized. I would have tried to fix it. I would have taken the blame, because that was my job in the family, to be the shock absorber for everyone else's bad behavior. But the old Claire was gone. I had left her standing by that backyard fence. I let the silence sit for a long moment, let her sobs fill the space between us. When I spoke again, my voice was devoid of heat, of anger, of anything at all. It was the voice of a final judgment. I remember when I came to Mom about the forged contract. I remember showing her the proof that you had committed a crime in my name. I remember her telling me not to make waves. I remember the exact words she used. Hannah. She looked me in the eye and she said, "Family first." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. She was right, I continued, my voice dropping to an almost whisper. She taught me a very important lesson that day. She taught me about priorities. So you can tell her that I'm just following her advice. It's just that the priorities have changed. It used to be family first. Now, it's accountability first. The sobbing stopped. It was as if I had thrown a switch. The other end of the line went completely, utterly quiet. There was no breathing, no sniffing, no shuffling, just a dead, electric hum. She was still there. I knew she was, but she had nothing to say. For the first time in our entire lives, my sister, Hannah Monroe, was speechless. She had reached into her arsenal of weapons, her rage, her ridicule, her guilt, and found it empty. I had disarmed her, not with a shout, but with a simple, cold truth. I stood there by the window, listening to the sound of her silence. It was a strange, hollow sound. I had imagined this moment in 1,000 different ways. I had imagined I would feel a rush of triumph, a surge of vindication. I had imagined I would feel powerful, finally, after a lifetime of feeling powerless. But I didn't. I just felt empty, a vast, quiet, desolate emptiness. The fight was over. I had won. But the battlefield was my own life, and the casualties were the last, cancerous remnants of what I had once called my family. There was no joy in this victory. There was only the quiet, grim satisfaction of a necessary amputation. The limb was gone, and with it, the disease. But the phantom pain would likely linger for a very long time. Still, as I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, I recognized the significance of that profound quiet. It was the sound of a dynamic that had defined my existence finally breaking. It was the sound of a story reaching its end. For the first time in my life, I was the one who got to hang up first. And for the first time in my life, I had heard my sister's silence. The courtroom was a study in beige and solemnity, polished wood, muted acoustics, and the low, indifferent hum of fluorescent lights created an atmosphere of sterile gravity. It was a place designed to strip emotion from human conflict, to reduce passion and pain to a series of exhibits and statutes. For a case that was born in the deceptive warmth of a backyard barbecue, the contrast was jarring. I sat beside Marcus Thorne at the plaintiff's table, my back perfectly straight. I wore the same charcoal gray suit from the shareholder meeting. It had become my uniform, the armor for this new, colder version of myself. Across the room, Hannah sat with her legal team. The blood-red dress was gone, replaced by a conservative navy blue suit. She looked smaller, diminished. The vibrant, predatory energy she usually radiated now contained and coiled into a tight knot of defiance. In the first row of the gallery, my mother sat alone. Richard was not with her. She looked aged, her face a pale, strained mask. She stared straight ahead at the judge's bench, a deliberate, rigid posture that ensured she would not have to accidentally meet my gaze. The proceedings had been going on for 2 days, a blur of motions and objections, but today was the day the evidence would be presented. My evidence. Marcus was in his element, a shark gliding through his natural habitat. He moved with a quiet, lethal confidence, his voice never rising above a conversational tone as he systematically dismantled Hannah's defense before she had even presented it. "Your Honor," he began, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room, "we will demonstrate a clear and undeniable pattern of intellectual property theft and fraud." On the large screen mounted on the wall, an email appeared. It was from Hannah to the McVeigh-Norris contractor, sent from her personal account. "Just looping you in on the final details Claire and I discussed." It read, Marcus then displayed the server logs, showing I had been logged out of the system for 2 full hours when that email was supposedly sent. He brought up a side-by-side comparison of my real signature from my employment contract and the one on the McVeigh-Norris bid. They were nearly identical, a testament to the countless hours Hannah must have spent practicing my name as a child, a casual violation I had never thought twice about until now. Hannah's lawyer, a florid, expensive man named Peterson, objected repeatedly, but the evidence was clean, the chain of custody perfect. Marcus had built a fortress, and Peterson was throwing pebbles at its walls. Then came Hannah's turn to testify. She walked to the stand, her composure absolute. She was a performer, and this was her most important role. She swore the oath, her voice clear and unwavering. Peterson began gently, "Ms. Monroe, please tell the court, in your own words, about your relationship with your sister, the plaintiff." Hannah gave a sad, magnanimous smile. "My sister Claire is brilliant," she began, her voice full of feigned warmth. "Truly, especially with computers, but she has always been very emotional, prone to feelings of jealousy. When she was demoted for performance-related issues, I believe she became vengeful. And the documents Mr. Thorne has presented," Peterson prompted. "Forgeries," Hannah said, shaking her head with practiced sorrow. "Not the signatures, but the documents themselves. Claire is a genius with code. She had back-end access to our systems. She had the ability and, sadly, the motive to fabricate these logs, to alter these emails. She didn't steal my work. I believe she hacked our system to frame me after the Brightwell deal fell through. She was good. She was weaving the narrative she had created for me years ago, the unstable, emotional, jealous sister, into a credible-sounding motive." For a moment, a sliver of doubt seemed to hang in the air. But Marcus had been waiting for this. He rose for the cross-examination, a thin, predatory smile on his lips. He didn't question her about the emails or the logs. He asked her about code. "Ms. Monroe," he began, "could you please explain to the court the difference between a SHA 256 and a SHA 512 cryptographic hash?" Hannah blinked. "I'm a CEO, not an IT technician." "Of course," Marcus said smoothly, "but the Logicore 2.0 software, the one you claim to have acquired for the company, surely you were involved in the technical due diligence." "I have a team for that," she said, her voice a little tighter. "So you have no first-hand knowledge of the software's architecture, no idea how its core security protocols function." "I understand its business application," she snapped. "I see," Marcus said, turning to the judge. "The plaintiff calls our final witness, Dr. Alistair Finch." Dr. Finch was a small, neat man with a tidy gray beard and an air of unimpeachable academic authority. He was a court-appointed, independent expert in digital forensics and cryptography. He explained to the court, in simple, clear terms, what a cryptographic signature was. "Think of it like digital DNA." "Your Honor," he said, gesturing to the screen, "when a developer compiles a piece of code, they can embed a unique, encrypted key. It is not part of the user interface. It is not something you can see or alter without the original encryption key. It is a fundamental, unchangeable part of the code's very structure." Marcus nodded. "Dr. Finch, you were tasked by the court with examining the source code of the Logicore 2.0 system. What did you find?" Dr. Finch adjusted his glasses. "I found embedded cryptographic signatures in every single one of the 418 core modules of the program. Every signature, without exception, is registered to the username C. Monroe Dev, and every signature is time-stamped. dating from a period 2 years before Monroe and Daughters Logistics claims to have acquired the software. The courtroom was utterly, profoundly silent. The low hum of the lights seemed to roar in the vacuum. This wasn't my word against hers. This wasn't a family squabble. This was science. It was mathematics. It was an absolute, objective truth that her charm and her lies could not touch. "And is it possible," Marcus asked, his voice low and deliberate, "for these signatures to have been faked? Could someone, as the defendant claims, have hacked the system to insert them after the fact?" "No, Dr." Finch said simply. "To do so would be akin to changing a person's DNA after they've been born. It's a cryptographic impossibility." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Every eye in the room was on Hannah. The mask of the confident CEO was gone. The defiant performer had left the stage. All that was left was a woman whose entire world had just been invalidated by a truth she could not spin. The judge, a woman with a stern, impassive face, looked down from her bench. She didn't look at me or at Hannah. She looked at the evidence summary in front of her. She cleared her throat. The sound was like a thunderclap in the still room. "Based on the irrefutable testimony of the court's expert witness and the overwhelming supporting evidence," she said, her voice a flat, unemotional declaration of fact, "this court finds in favor of the plaintiff. Legal ownership of the intellectual property known as Logicore 2.0 belongs to Ms. Claire Monroe." She picked up the small wooden gavel. It rose, and for a heart-stopping second, it hung in the air. Then it fell. The sharp, definitive crack of wood on wood echoed through the courtroom. Hannah crumpled. It was not a dramatic, theatrical collapse. It was a slow, quiet deflation, as if her bones had suddenly dissolved. Her head bowed, her shoulders slumped, and she stared down at the polished table as if it were an abyss that was about to swallow her whole. My gaze, for the first and only time that day, drifted to the gallery, to my mother. Her face was ashen. She was looking down at her own hands, clasped tightly in her lap, refusing to see her defeated daughter, refusing to acknowledge her victorious one. In that moment of her averted gaze, I saw the final, irrevocable severing of the cord. I felt nothing, no surge of joy, no satisfaction, no vengeful thrill. The victory was not a celebration. It was a clinical procedure, an excision of a sickness I had carried my entire life. The sound of the gavel was not a sound of triumph. It was the sound of a door being locked for the final time. It was the sound of the end, and after it, there was only silence. The gavel's crack did not signal the end of the noise, but the beginning of a different kind. The quiet, procedural hum of the courtroom was replaced by the cacophonous roar of public collapse. A reputation, I learned, does not die silently. It thrashes and screams and shatters like glass, and everyone gathers to watch. Hannah's downfall was not a single, clean event, but a cascade of failures, each one triggering the next in a slow, brutal domino effect. The board of directors, which had once lauded her as a visionary, now saw her as a liability of catastrophic proportions. Her suspension became a termination. The language of the press release, cold and clinical, terminated for cause, citing gross misconduct and a fundamental breach of fiduciary duty. The words were a corporate tombstone, elegantly engraved and utterly final. The business community, a world that runs on reputation and trust, turned its back on her overnight. The invitations to charity galas and industry panels stopped arriving. The fawning profiles in business magazines were quietly removed from their websites. She went from being a titan of industry to a cautionary tale whispered over cocktails and boardroom lunches. Her name became synonymous with hubris and fraud. She was a social leper, cast out of the very circles she had fought so ruthlessly to enter. Then came the financial ruin. With the company's stock in the gutter and its future uncertain, the banks that had financed her lavish lifestyle grew nervous. The sprawling house in the Denver suburbs, the very place where my fate had been sealed by their laughter, became an albatross. The mortgage payments, once a trivial expense, became an impossibility. I saw the notice in a public listing online, a foreclosure auction. The stage for her perfect family life was being dismantled and sold off to the highest bidder. I pictured the empty patio, the wrought iron table where they had toasted to my accident, and felt a profound, chilling sense of cosmic irony. My life, in contrast, became an exercise in quiet order. I was no longer a ghost in someone else's machine. The court's decision had not just returned my software to me. It had returned my name, and my name, it turned out, now had value. The emails began to trickle in, first from tech recruiters, then from venture capitalists. But the one that made me pause came from a man named Robert Chen, the vice president of McVeigh Norris, the company from the original forged contract. His email was short and direct. Ms. Monroe, I followed the court proceedings with great interest. Your work on the Logicor system is, frankly, revolutionary, and your actions, while unorthodox, demonstrated a level of integrity our industry sorely needs. We are in the process of overhauling our own internal logistics network. We would love to hire you on a consultation basis to help guide the project. The compensation would be substantial. Let me know if you'd be interested in discussing it further. Sincerely, Robert Chen. I read the email 3 times. This was the ultimate vindication. A job offer born from the very crime that was meant to be my undoing. It was a corner office, a 7-figure contract, a seat at the table I had always been denied. It was everything I was supposed to have wanted. It was the chance to step into Hannah's world, to take her place. And I felt absolutely nothing. The thought of stepping into her shoes, of playing the same game she had played, felt like putting on a dead woman's clothes. It felt like a continuation, not an ending. My goal was never to replace her. My goal was never to become the new queen. It was to abdicate, to walk away from the entire rotten kingdom. I had not burned down the castle so I could sit on the throne. I had burned it down so I could leave. I typed back a polite, concise reply. Mr. Chen, thank you for your generous offer and your kind words. At this time, however, I am not seeking new employment opportunities. I wish you the best of luck with your project. Regards, Claire Monroe. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. It was the easiest, most liberating decision I had ever made. The final encounter happened on a gray Tuesday afternoon a month later. Marcus had asked me to meet him at the old Monroe and Daughters office building to sign some final transfer of facet documents. The company was in receivership, a shell of its former self being picked apart by creditors. The lobby was desolate, the crisp, navy blue logo behind the reception desk now seeming like a relic from a fallen empire. As I was leaving, the elevator doors opened, and there she was. She was not coming in. She was just standing there, as if she had ridden the elevator down with no destination in mind. The transformation was shocking. The designer suit was gone, replaced by simple jeans and a worn gray sweater. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her face was pale and puffy, devoid of makeup. She looked like a ghost haunting the lobby of her former life. Her eyes met mine. The fire was gone. The arrogance, the condescension, the cruel amusement. All of it had been extinguished. All that was left was a hollow, desolate emptiness that mirrored my own. She looked away first, her gaze dropping to the scuffed toes of her sneakers. I made to walk past her, to leave the building and her behind forever. But she spoke, her voice so soft it was barely a whisper, a rustle of dead leaves on pavement. I'm sorry. The words hung in the sterile, empty air between us. 2 words. After 34 years of 1,000 cuts, she was offering a single, flimsy bandage. I stopped, but I did not turn to face her. I stood there, my back to her, and I dissected the words in my mind. What was she sorry for? For the theft? For the lies? For the humiliation? Was she sorry for what she had done, or was she just sorry that she had been caught? Was this an apology for my pain, or an expression of her own? I knew the answer. It was a desperate, last-ditch attempt at absolution, a plea for a peace I could not give her because I had not yet found it for myself. To accept her apology would be to validate it, to agree that this small, pathetic offering was sufficient payment for the debt she owed. It would make us sisters again, bound by the transaction of forgiveness, and I was done being her sister. I said nothing. My silence was my answer. It was the coldest, cruelest thing I had ever done to her, and it was the only honest response I had left to give. I felt, more than saw, her turn away. I heard the soft scuff of her shoes on the marble floor as she walked towards the exit, defeated. As her footsteps receded, I turned my head slightly, just enough to see her shrinking form. I spoke to the empty air she had left behind, my voice as quiet as hers had been, a final private entry in a ledger that was now closed. That's one apology I can't file. The heavy glass door to the street closed behind her. It didn't slam. It swung shut with a soft, hydraulic sigh, the latch catching with a gentle, definitive click. The sound was small, almost inaudible in the vast, empty lobby, but it echoed like a gunshot. My last day at the office was not in the small, windowless room where I'd been exiled. It was in the spacious corner office that had once been Hannah's, and before that, my father's, the board, in a gesture of either extreme guilt or legal caution, had insisted I use it to oversee the final legal transfers of the Logicor IP. For a week, I worked from behind the vast mahogany desk, surrounded by the ghosts of a life that was never mine. Today was the last day. I wasn't overseeing anything. I was just packing up the few personal items I had kept at my old desk in administrative services, which I'd had a young intern fetch for me. They all fit into a single, small cardboard box, a coffee mug with a chipped rim, a framed photo of my father and me at a Rockies game, a few lonely pens, and a single, wilting succulent that had somehow survived my neglect. It was a sad, meager collection, a testament to a life lived in the margins, a career spent deliberately not putting down roots in a place that had never felt like home. When the box was packed, I stood for a moment and looked around the CEO's office. Hannah's personal touches were gone, of course, replaced by a sterile corporate anonymity, but one thing remained. On the wall opposite the desk was a large framed print of the company's logo, the one my father had designed with a graphic artist 30 years ago. Monroe and Daughters Logistics. I had looked at that logo thousands of times in my life. It was on every letterhead, every truck, every building. It was the backdrop to my entire existence. But today, I saw it for the first time. My eyes traced the elegant, confident script, the strong, solid Monroe, the graceful connecting ampersand, and then the final word, daughters, plural. The realization landed not as a lightning strike of fresh anger, but as a quiet, somber settling of a truth I had always known but never allowed myself to fully articulate. It was a lie. It had always been a lie. There was only one daughter in that equation. Hannah was the daughter. I was just the silent, uncredited logistics. I was the engine, the plumbing, the invisible framework that allowed the beautiful facade to stand. The plural was a marketing choice, a pretty fiction my father had told himself because he wanted it to be true, but it wasn't. I reached into the box and took out the framed photo of my father. I looked at his smiling, hopeful face. I didn't feel anger towards him, only a deep, profound sadness for his blind spot, for the dream he couldn't quite make real. He had built the company for his daughters, but he had built his family around only one of them. That afternoon, I met with Marcus at his office. The final paperwork was ready. It established a new corporate entity, a holding company to which all intellectual property rights for the Logicor system would be legally and irrevocably transferred. The name on the incorporation documents was not Monroe Systems. It was Monroe Systems. Marcus had questioned the spelling. A typo? Claire, he'd asked, his pen hovering over the signature line. No, I had replied. It's intentional. Deleting that final E was the most significant act of my life. It was a surgical removal. It was a declaration that my legacy would not be spelled the same way as my pain. My father's name was Monroe. The name on the trucks, the name my mother still carried, the name Hannah had disgraced that was Monroe. Mine would be different. It was a quiet, personal amputation, a severing of the final letter that connected me to them. It was mine now. Back in the corner office, I logged into the system for the last time. I initiated the final, legally binding digital transfer of the source code and all its associated patents to the secure servers of Monroe Systems. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, a thin green line rewriting my future. Then, I opened my email. I composed a message to the interim CEO and the remaining members of the board of directors. It was my resignation, effective immediately. I kept it brief, professional, but I added one final sentence at the end, a closing statement for a trial that had been waged not in a courtroom, but in the silent hallways of my own heart. No hard feelings, just accountability. I hit send. As the screen refreshed, confirming the message was gone, I stood up and picked up my small cardboard box. It was time to go. I walked out of the office and into the main bullpen. The atmosphere at the company had changed in the weeks since Hannah's departure. The air of fear and competitive anxiety had been replaced by a strange, fragile sense of hope. The people who remained were not Hannah's political allies, but the quiet, competent workers who, like me, had done the actual work: the engineers, the accountants, the dispatchers, the logistics. As I walked towards the elevator bank, one of the senior software engineers, a woman named Maria whom I had occasionally helped with system glitches, stood up from her desk. She began to clap. It wasn't loud or boisterous. It was a soft, steady, rhythmic sound. Then, another person stood up and joined her, and another, soon. The entire floor of 20 or so employees was on their feet, their applause a soft, rolling wave of sound that washed over me. They were not applauding my revenge. They were applauding my courage. They were applauding the fact that someone had finally held the bully accountable. They were clapping for the silence that now existed where Hannah's tirades used to be. For a moment, I was overwhelmed, a lump forming in my throat. I gave a single, small nod of acknowledgement, a gesture that felt both inadequate and overwhelmingly sincere. Then I turned and stepped into the waiting elevator. The doors slid shut, sealing me off from the sound. As the elevator descended, I looked at my reflection in the polished steel doors. I looked tired, but for the first time in years, I looked peaceful. I walked out of the building and into the bright afternoon sun. I didn't rush to my car. I stopped on the sidewalk and looked back one last time at the glass and steel facade of the Monroe and Daughters Logistics Building. I had spent more than a decade of my life in that building, feeling like a trespasser. I had walked its halls carrying a weight of resentment so heavy it was a wonder I could stand at all. But now, looking at it, I felt no pain, no anger, just a quiet, clean, and profound sense of peace. It wasn't a tomb anymore. It was just a building. The Denver sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The air was crisp and cool. It felt like the first day of a new season. A new era was beginning. My era. It was an era that would be defined by a family that was smaller by 3 people. My mother, my stepfather, and my sister were no longer part of my equation. The loss felt vast, but it did not feel tragic. It felt necessary. I finally understood. I hadn't lost anything in that building. Not really. What I had lost was the exhausting, soul-crushing burden of hope. The hope that one day they would see me. The hope that one day they would love me. The hope that one day I would be enough. The truth was, I hadn't lost a family. I had just finally stopped hoping for one I never had. 6 months later, a journalist from a national business magazine finally managed to secure a short interview. They wanted a follow-up piece, the human interest angle to the corporate implosion. We met in a minimalist coffee shop, a neutral ground of my choosing. The journalist, a young woman with earnest eyes and a digital recorder placed precisely between us, was fishing for a story of redemption, of healing, of the kind of neat, tidy emotional resolution that sells magazines. She asked about Monroe Systems, about my plans for the software, about the future. I gave her polite, brief, and uninteresting answers. I could see her growing frustrated, her narrative slipping through her fingers. Finally, she leaned in, lowering her voice as if to share a secret, and asked the question she had been waiting for the entire time. "It's an incredible story of survival, Ms. Monroe, but looking back at it all," she said, her eyes searching mine for a flicker of regret, of softness. "The family you lost, the pain it must have caused everyone. If you could go back to that day, to the moment you raised your hand in that ballroom, would you do it all again? Is there a part of you that can find it in your heart to forgive them?" The question hung in the air. Forgiveness. The world is obsessed with it. It's presented as the ultimate act of strength, the final stage of healing, a gift you give yourself. But I had come to see it differently. Forgiveness felt like a release, an absolution I had not been granted, and was therefore not in the business of granting to others. It felt like pretending the wound wasn't a scar. I looked at the earnest young woman across the table, at her pen poised to capture my profound, healing words. I thought of the sound of their laughter. I thought of my mother's text message. I thought of Hannah's hollow apology in the lobby. These were not mistakes. They were choices. 1,000 tiny choices made over 34 years that culminated in a single, ugly truth. They weren't accidents. They were the destination they had been driving towards all along. "Forgiveness," I said, and my voice was calm and measured, leaving no room for misinterpretation, "is for accidents. They planned theirs." The journalist stared at me, her pen frozen above the notepad. She had her headline. I never went back to the house while they still lived there. The foreclosure auction took care of that. I learned from a public record search that a young family from out of state had bought it. I felt a strange sense of relief for them, that the walls would now hear the laughter of children instead of the echoes of a family devouring itself. One afternoon, a few weeks after the interview, I found myself driving. I didn't have a destination in mind, but my hands on the steering wheel seemed to. I took the familiar exit off the highway, navigated the curving suburban streets, the muscle memory of 1,000 dutiful family visits still etched into my subconscious. I parked down the street, just as I had on that last day. The house looked different. The new owners had painted the shutters a cheerful blue. There were toys on the lawn, but the side of the house, the path to the backyard, was still the same. The wooden gate was still there. I don't know what compelled me. I got out of the car. My feet carried me down the sidewalk, my hand reaching out for the familiar, rough wood of the gate. It was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped through. The backyard was a place caught between past and future. The new family hadn't gotten to landscaping it yet. The vibrant, meticulously manicured lawn Hannah had been so proud of was gone. The grass was long and patched with weeds. The rose bushes my mother had tended were overgrown and choked with thorns. And in the center of the yard, where the heart of their happy family life once beat, the wrought iron patio table still stood. It was rusted now, a skeletal relic. The chairs were gone. A single, grimy wineglass, missed by the movers, lay on its side near one of the legs. The scene was one of profound and fitting desolation. This was the place where everything had ended. This was the ground zero of my new life. I walked to the table, my shoes sinking into the damp, untended earth. From my pocket, I took a small, silver USB drive. It was not one of the originals. It was a fresh one, completely empty, a symbolic piece of plastic and metal. It held nothing but the weight of my intention. I placed it in the very center of the rusted table, a final offering at a dead altar. I thought of their laughter, the sound that had started it all, a sound so confident, so dismissive, so sure of its power over me. It felt like a lifetime ago. "You laughed once," I whispered to the empty yard, to the ghosts of the people who were now strangers. Then, I turned my back on the table, on the yard, on the house, on the entire suffocating history of Claire Monroe. I walked away. I did not hesitate, I did not falter, and I did not, for a single second, look back. As I reached the gate, a cool breeze rustled the overgrown leaves, a sound like a final, quiet sigh. The sun was warm on my face. My footsteps on the pavement were the only sound, a steady, rhythmic beat, carrying me forward. A single thought, clear and bright as the Denver sky, bloomed in my mind. It was the truth that had taken me 34 years to learn. It was the end of their story, and the first line of mine. Sound of footsteps, a gentle, atmospheric musical score begins to swell. Voiceover. I didn't crash. I arrived. Screen goes to black. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to see how far this story has traveled and hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And if you really want to support what I do, hit that hype button to help this story get heard by even more people.